Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today I'm going to show you a family tree of English Bible translations. As you probably know, there are a lot of different translations available these days, from old ones like the King James Version to new ones like the English Standard Version. In this video, I'll be explaining the differences between all of the various translations, as well as going through the history of how the Bible came to be translated into English in the first place. Finally, I'll be ending things by sharing with you which translation I personally like the best. I'm going to start by explaining the three colors used on the chart. As you probably know, the Bible was originally written in Hebrew and Greek. The Old Testament, aka the Jewish Bible, was written in Hebrew, with a tiny bit of Aramaic here and there. The oldest complete copy of this part of the Bible, in the original Hebrew, is called the Masoretic text. And generally speaking, this is what Bible translators use when translating the Old Testament. However, the New Testament is a bit more tricky. This is because there are many different Greek manuscripts available that scholars can use. Generally, these fall into three main categories. First, there are Western manuscripts, which go back to the early days of the church in Rome. They were used to create the Vulgate, which is the Latin version of the Bible that was used by the Catholic Church for many centuries. On this chart, the English translations that are based mainly on the Vulgate are colored in red. Second, there are the Byzantine manuscripts, also known as the majority text. Most of these manuscripts were created by the Eastern Church when Constantinople was the capital of the Roman Empire. And in 1516, they were used to create a Greek version of the New Testament known as the Textus Receptus. The English translations that are based mainly on the Textus Receptus are colored in blue. Finally, there are Alexandrian manuscripts, also known as the neutral text. These include some manuscripts that were found quite recently, like within the last 100 years or so. Generally, these manuscripts are the oldest, and therefore they are considered to be the most reliable. They form the basis of the Novum Testamentum Graece, also known as the Nestle-Aland text, which is the Greek text that most scholars use today. So, the English translations that are based mainly on the Nestle-Aland, or its precursors, are colored in yellow. Okay, so let's now start up at the top and look at some of the earliest attempts to translate the Bible into English. The first major attempt was made by a priest named John Wycliffe, and he relied entirely on the Latin Vulgate. Now, he actually died before his translation was done, but some of his colleagues finished it for him around 1390. But one thing to keep in mind about Wycliffe's Bible is that it was actually written in Middle English, not Modern English, so it actually makes for pretty difficult reading. The first Bible to be written in Modern English was the Tyndale Bible, translated by William Tyndale, using both the Vulgate as well as a bit of the original Hebrew and Greek. Now, Tyndale was one of the early leaders of the Protestant Reformation, and this came through in his work, which actually led to his execution for heresy in 1536. Because he died early, he wasn't able to finish the complete Bible. So the Tyndale Bible actually only includes the New Testament, the Pentateuch, and the Book of Jonah. Now, ironically, just a few short years after ordering the execution of William Tyndale, King Henry VIII of England authorized the Great Bible, which was based mostly on the Tyndale Bible, with the rest of the Old Testament being finished by a priest named Miles Coverdale. It was the first English Bible to be used in the church services of the Church of England. However, at this point, it was still too expensive for the average person to own a book the size of the Bible. That all changed with the publication of the Geneva Bible in 1560. This Bible was very different for several reasons. First of all, its New Testament was based on the Textus Receptus rather than on the Vulgate. The Textus Receptus was a Greek New Testament created a few decades earlier by the Dutch philosopher Erasmus, using all of the best Byzantine manuscripts available to him at the time. Secondly, the Geneva Bible was created by Calvinists, and hence was thoroughly Protestant. Third, it was the first English Bible to use the chapter and verse divisions that we still use to this day. And fourth, it was mass-produced, and therefore was the first Bible to end up in the hands of the average English-speaking person. However, the Anglican bishops at the time were not happy about the Geneva Bible, as they were worried that it might undermine their authority. They therefore produced the Bishop's Bible just a few years later. The Bishop's Bible was authorized by Queen Elizabeth I, so England ended up with a situation in which the Bishop's Bible was the one being read from the pulpit, but the Geneva Bible was the one being read in the pews. This problem was solved in 1611 with the publication of the most famous English translation of all time, the King James Version. It was the third Bible to be authorized by an English monarch, this time by James I, and it was based on both the Bishop's Bible and the Geneva Bible. The KJV, as it is now known, is still one of the best-selling Bible translations to this day. In fact, there are some Christians who will only use this particular translation, claiming that it is the only one that is fully accurate. Now, while I don't agree with that idea, one thing I do agree with is that the language of the King James is particularly beautiful. Its iconic language has impacted the English language more than any other book ever published. In fact, it is estimated that over 250 English idioms can be traced directly back to phrases first used in the King James Bible. Okay, now before I move on, I'll quickly point out another translation that was created around the same time as the King James, the Douay-Rheims Bible. The Douay-Rheims was produced by the Catholic Church at the time, and as such was based on the Vulgate. All right, let's now move on past the King James. The first and only authorized revision of the King James Version was the English Revised Version, often simply referred to as the RV, or Revised Version. It came out in the UK in 1885 and was quickly followed by the closely related American Standard Version in the US in 1901. Now, these two new translations differ from the King James in a very important way. You see, in the centuries that followed the publication of the King James, many new manuscripts were found. This allowed scholars to create what's called a critical version of the Greek New Testament, one that combined all of the available manuscripts together, but in particular relied heavily on the Alexandrian text type, which represents the oldest and most accurate tradition. So the Revised Version, and everything that comes after it, uses this new critical text instead of the much older Textus Receptus. Nowadays, the critical text comes in the form of the Nestle-Aland Novum Testamentum Graecae, which I mentioned earlier, and which is also sometimes referred to as the UBS text, which stands for the United Bible Society. Okay, now after the American Standard Version, the tree splits in a few different directions. We get the RSV, the NASB, and the Living Bible, all of which were based directly on the American Standard Version. Let's start with the RSV, or Revised Standard Version, which dates to the 1950s. This translation stands out as being important because it was the first truly ecumenical translation. Ecumenical means that it was produced by scholars representing several different Christian denominations. In this case, there were Protestants, Catholics, Greek Orthodox Christians, and even a Jewish rabbi. It was also the first English Bible to get rid of most of the these and thous. However, the RSV ended up being controversial, mostly because of how it translated Isaiah 7:14. In the previous version, this verse read, "The Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son." The Hebrew word for virgin there is alma, and it actually just means young woman. So the RSV changed this verse to, "The Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a young woman shall conceive and bear a son." Christians understand this verse as being a direct reference to Jesus. So the change, although arguably more accurate, made a lot of people unhappy. This in part led to the creation of the NASB, or New American Standard Bible. However, the NASB mostly stands out because it is generally considered to be the most literal translation of the Bible available in English. A literal translation is basically a word-for-word translation with just a little bit of rearranging here and there so that the text is readable. Now, all of the translations that we've looked at so far have been literal, but the NASB is even more literal. The Living Bible is the complete opposite. In fact, it's not a translation at all. Rather, it's a paraphrase. And in this case, it was done by just one man, Kenneth Taylor. However, it made the Bible super easy to read, and therefore people really liked it. But for now, let's go back to the RSV. The Revised Standard Version was replaced in 1989 by the New Revised Standard Version. Both of these are published by the National Council of Churches, which is an umbrella organization that represents most of the mainline denominations in the United States. Now, at this point, I should probably explain the term mainline. These days, churches can basically be divided into two main categories: mainline and evangelical. Generally speaking, mainline churches are the more liberal ones, like the Methodists or Episcopalians, whereas evangelicals are the more conservative ones, like the Baptists or Pentecostals. To this day, the NRSV is the translation that is preferred by most mainline Christians, as well as by academics. And I should point out that one of the main differences between the RSV and the NRSV is that the NRSV is gender neutral. So, for example, Matthew 19:23 in the RSV reads, "It will be hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven," whereas the NRSV reads, "It will be hard for a rich person." Now, the NRSV was actually updated very recently. The latest version, known as the NRSV Updated Edition, was released last year in an electronic format. So, for example, if you go to BibleGateway.com, which lets you read the Bible in lots of different translations, you can already read the NRSV UE. And it's actually this coming week that the print versions are being released for the first time. Now, the updated version has once again created a bit of controversy, this time over 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 and 10. In the NASB, it says that neither effeminate nor homosexuals will inherit the kingdom of God. However, in the updated NRSV, it says, neither male prostitutes nor men who engage in illicit sex will inherit the kingdom of God. Okay, let's now switch from the NRSV, which is preferred by mainline Christians, to some of the translations preferred by evangelicals. The three most popular are the NIV, the ESV, and the NLT. Since its publication in 1978, the NIV, or New International Version, has pretty much remained in the top spot as the best-selling Bible in America. Unlike everything we've looked at so far, the NIV translators started from scratch and didn't rely on any previous translations. They also used a translation philosophy known as dynamic equivalence, meaning that instead of going word for word, they went phrase by phrase in an effort to create a more readable translation. This same general philosophy was used for the NLT, or New Living Translation, which came out in 1996. However, in this case, the translators used Kenneth Taylor's Living Bible as a starting point and tried to retain its popular style. The ESV, however, is very different. It's much more literal and is based off the old RSV. Basically, it's a conservative alternative to the more liberal NRSV. Okay, there's still several more translations to cover. First of all, I want to point out the JPS Tanakh, JPS standing for the Jewish Publication Society. Being a Jewish Bible, this translation only includes the Old Testament, which we Jews call the Tanakh. Interestingly, though, the original JPS Tanakh, published in 1917, was based on the American Standard Version, which is a Christian translation. However, the new JPS Tanakh, or NJPS, published in 1985, is not based on any previous work. It was created from scratch, from a team of Jewish scholars representing all three of the main branches of Judaism: Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. Then there's the New King James Version. Unlike all the other new translations, it is not based on the critical text of the New Testament. Like the Old King James, it is based on the Textus Receptus. For this reason, it is often preferred by Eastern Christians. For example, it is the translation used for the Greek Orthodox Study Bible. Let's now look at some Catholic translations. I mentioned the Douay Rheims Bible, but a much more recent Catholic translation is the NAB, or New American Bible, published in 1978. Be careful not to confuse this one with the NASB, which I mentioned earlier. The NAB is notable in that it's the only English Bible authorized by the Catholic Church in the U.S. to be read during Mass. However, in 2011, it was updated as the NAB Revised Edition, or NABRE. That one has yet to be authorized for use during Mass, but is recommended by the Catholic Church for personal use. Finally, there's the Holman Christian Standard Bible, now updated and known simply as the Christian Standard Bible, or CSB. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this particular version is popular mostly among Southern Baptists. Okay, now, as promised, I'm going to end by giving you my personal recommendations. First of all, I should say that anyone doing any sort of serious Bible study should never rely on just one translation. It's always best to compare several different versions, and if you're able to, it's even better to go back to the original Hebrew and Greek, perhaps by using an interlinear together with a Hebrew or Greek dictionary. However, I know that for everyday reading, most people like to have a go-to translation. For me, since I'm Jewish, I usually use the new JPS Tanakh for the Hebrew Bible and the NRSV for the New Testament. I like the NJPS because obviously it provides a more Jewish reading of the Bible. And I like the NRSV because it's very ecumenical and it's the one that most academics use. All right, so that was a look at the family tree of English Bible translations. If you want to download a free copy of this chart, I'll leave a link to it in the description. And don't forget to check out established titles while you're at it. Thanks for watching.